Hello, and welcome to this deeper dive with Mariah Schuld. And I'm so happy to be here with you, Mariah. There were so many questions that came up in my mind when we were listening to your talk earlier on. My goodness, what an incredibly interesting field to be in, and at the intersection, so it seems, of so many disciplines. I saw linear algebra, you talked about PDEs, you talked about uncertainty, and all these concepts also in deep learning and machine learning. But before I started, just wanted to share with you also some of the comments that you received during your talk, because there were so many nice comments in the chat, and I've received some also on Twitter and through other social media outlets. And a lot of people saying thank you, that it was a great talk, and one person also wrote, I really enjoyed the connections you made to different approaches, and that was one of the things I also really enjoyed in your talk. Now I've got lots of questions here for you, and I wanted to start off with a very simple one as a warm-up. And that's the question of how you got into this field. What made you choose this? And some people were interested in this, and I'm too, because this is an unusual field. There are just not so many people in the world doing this, and so yeah, everybody was excited to hear about what happened.
Yes. So actually, I didn't choose the field. It was very strange, actually. What happened was that, well, I have to tell you the context of my career. I wasn't actually always a physicist. I started off as a political scientist. And because I always thought physicists are a bit strange, they are like kind of, busy with their own thoughts and not really sociable and things like that. And maybe also a bit of peer pressure from my parents who thought like, maybe like a career in something where you're so specialized is, a bit dull or something like that. So it went like the other way actually here. And so I started studying political science, and then I couldn't stop though wanting to know about all of those things that physicists know about. I was interested in questions about reality, what we know about the universe and all of those things. So it was a very philosophical idea here. So what happened then is I wanted to study physics to a certain extent, but have actually a political science degree and then become a political scientist. But then basically when it came to getting a job, I was struggling a little bit to find jobs in political science, also because I always did both things. And I think when you have this background that no one really knows what to do with, what is this person who wants to work for the United Nations, but she's also a physicist? What's this? So basically, when it came to after my master's to get a job, I kind of was really struggling here in South Africa to find something. And so I decided to do a PhD. And now I had a superpower in my PhD. And that superpower was that I absolutely didn't care how successful I would be. I didn't need to write papers. I could just do whatever I wanted, because for me, it was more like a delay, the job search for another 3 years. And so I decided to do something together with my supervisor here in Durban. They were interested in something called quantum walks in biological neural networks in the brain. So we decided to do something in quantum machine learning. And the word didn't exist back then. And when I started my PhD, a month later, a very, very famous person published a paper on quantum machine learning. And that was the moment when you're like, I'm in business, something is happening here in the next years. And so during my PhD, this field really established itself and was almost born from nothing. So it was actually the other way around. I didn't pick a field, but I just didn't care about what to do. I just wanted to do something that sounded cool. And then the field developed. So it was a bit of a lucky draw there, I think.
Yeah, but it's still really courageous of you to say, oh, here's this exciting field. As you said, somebody famous write a paper, so there must be something in it, and let's just go and explore. That is not an easy thing to do. And when I talk to students about making choices, a lot of them are really worried about jumping into the deep and cold, if you'd like, in sort of a sink or swim. So tell us about what that was like for you to enter this field. You obviously knew a lot about math and physics already, but you probably didn't have everything that you needed to really understand what was going on.
Yes, and actually, what I did last week, so you mentioned that I wrote a book together with my PhD supervisor. That was a couple of years ago, and we were busy writing the second edition now, like last week. And I realized, going back in what I did in my PhD, what was in the first edition of the book, to what I understand now, there's just it's just worlds between. I was very naive back then. But the experience I had when kind of all of these things started and I was in this murky water in a PhD was twofold. So the one experience was I got a lot of slack. I got a lot of negative feedback from very established scientists. So, when you always hear like, oh, when I was young, like, everyone told me don't do it, and then I did it anyways. But this really happened. Like, a lot of people told me don't go in a field that doesn't exist. It just, you will fail, this will happen, and this will happen. So I had to like push a little bit against those things. But the second thing was that all I wanted was basically friends. My biggest dream was one day to have a conference where people would speak about these things that I'm looking into every day. And I had a lot of freedom to look into them. So because, there was not like these papers you have to read, or the old guys have already stomped out like the directions to go in. So you could really like do everything from scratch. And this is something I really appreciate and I really liked. But what was really lacking was literally just your research community, right? That you always go to conferences and you talk about things where you're always the odd one. So maybe like in this context, I'm still a little bit the odd one. But that was kind of the most beautiful part of this PhD, was then after like 2 or 3 years to slowly collect those people who are interested in this field. We became friends, and these networks still exist. And it's a very nice community, I must say. And also, when you start a community, and I think actually when you enter one as well, and you start getting a little bit more self-confident, you can really shape the community. And so, for example, the way we shaped it, we were all young. For some reason, most of the people in early quantum machine learning were salsa dancers. So every time there was a conference, we would go salsa dancing. And that was just a culture that, for a couple of years has established itself. Now, everything is too big to like have these things happening this way anymore. But so it was kind of not so much this problem with not knowing what to do, because I wasn't really too worried if something good would come out of this. I was just interested, and but it was more like to find those people who are like-minded. And I realized how wonderful it actually is when you can speak to someone and they know the language of your research. It's just, everyone knows that, I think. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about how this field has been growing. Were you really one of the very first people to enter this together with your collaborator? And how big is this field now? Do you really see an uptick in this? I know, for example, that you've been giving many talks around the world, and that's how we found you too. I was looking at some talks at IPAM here in Southern California, and there you were giving this wonderful workshop, and that really got me interested in, and we thought, oh, we need to have her for the WiDS conference. But tell us a little bit about the growth of this field, and where do you think this will go?
Yes. So in terms of also the content, the first thing in the first couple of years of quantum machine learning, what people did, and by people I mean everyone was a quantum computing researcher, right? So there were no machine learning people. Not actually one of us was a machine learning researcher, but most of them were quantum computing specialists. And we did what quantum computing people do. And quantum computing people are only interested in computational complexity. I'm simplifying here a little bit, but so the type of research they do is like they take a classical algorithm and then they try to like put it onto a quantum computer to get the same results but faster. And then the type of analysis you see in the paper are asymptotic, like bounds. So everything is always like made in bounds. How much, if this is the precision you want to get out there, how many qubits do you need? Like how do these things grow? And to write a good paper, you always have to show that there's at least a quadratic speed up in your, runtime of the algorithm. So this was the first stage of quantum machine learning as well. We looked into things like regression and matrix inversion. So, matrix inversion, we have a quantum algorithm for that. So let's just like outsource it to a quantum computer, see how can we speed up things? We need to make assumptions on the data. Is this actually realistic? And so this was the type of work in the beginning. And that made me very unhappy after a while, because so now, my colleagues know this, but it's, you shouldn't say this loud, but I found this boring. I can't tell you why. So up to today, I find computational complexity, I find it interesting as a philosophical or like an information theoretic concept, but to do machine learning, I find it really boring. Maybe because machine learning works without worrying about, how I don't know, hard the problem of, non-convex optimization is or something like that. So far was the wrong tool. And then so in my own mind, but also the whole field, and I guess these things just go along when you're like very connected, there was really a big shift in people now starting to use these new quantum computers, these near-term devices, where your computational complexity doesn't matter. You have to run these things. You have to deal with noise. You have to actually really implement things. And so when the field started really growing was actually when they discovered that we can do quantum computing in a slightly different sense. So not only talk about this theory, but actually be a lot more practical about stuff. This didn't come without challenges, obviously, because as I mentioned in my talk, like you guys, you run MNIST only if you want to just do a quick proof of principle check of your algorithm or something like that. So for us to do MNIST on a quantum computer is impossible. We have to downsample it or like downsize it with PCA or something like that. So to actually do these things is also comes with a very big set of challenges. But then so like after this like big change happened and we started doing quantum computing in a very new way, in a very different way, in a very near-term way in some sense, then all of a sudden the lots of students came in, the companies came in. So quantum machine learning is deeply rooted in like the big software players and the big IT companies, so Google, IBM, the startups like where I'm working at. And then I think this mixture of like having jobs in industry or offering jobs in industry, offering also good salaries after graduating, combining quantum computing with machine learning, which is a hot topic anyways, I think this like inspired a lot of young people then to enter the field. And so now I would say that now the community is a couple of thousand people big. Like when you have a talk, you easily can get an audience of 1,000 or 2,000 people for a talk. Not easily, but these are the bigger events that you get. Meanwhile, our first workshop, these were like 8 people and, meeting somewhere in a nice beach lodge or something like that. So the growth was really big. And maybe we find soon a winter where we get into our first decline where there's a bit of disillusionment of, so we reduce the stuff that quantum computers can do better in machine learning step by step. And obviously then the magic also leaves us a little bit, but some really interesting things come up now that are a bit more solid, I think.
Yeah, it's been intriguing for many, many years. And one of the reasons why I'm so happy to hear all of this is that when I was a student, which is way too long ago, for what I like, I'm getting a little bit old here. But when I was a student, I remember excitement about a talk on quantum computing where one of my now colleagues at Stanford University was talking about what was going to happen in the next decade or two, maybe in this field. And he at the time predicted that quantum computing would just take off and obliterate all other kinds of computing architectures that were out there. Well, it didn't quite happen, but I keep waiting for this moment where we've reached sort of the we're going around the corner and we're really making this happen now. We're really seeing this take off. Do you think we're there?
No, and I think have a very critical opinion towards these things. So, like in 30 years or 40 years time, lots of very, very clever people thought about this question, what can we do better with quantum computers? And obviously in the media and in the funding applications, it's always phrased in a way of quantum computers are strictly speaking better. But if you're a scientist, these statements about something is better than something else, I mean, it's exactly like in machine learning, a neural network is better than a Gaussian process. So, I mean, if you're any researcher there, this doesn't make any sense, this statement. You have to say on what, about what neural network are you talking about? What's your benchmark? And so once you understand all of these assumptions that you make to make the statement that quantum computers are better, it's actually a very small statement, in my mind at least. So it has to do with very specific problems and we can't even put our finger on what's really better. So to construct, we don't know the secret sauce that constructs better algorithms. We have to find the algorithms in piecewise hand work. And there may be 2 or 3 base algorithms out there where we know we can get proven speedups. And even the proofs, like maybe it's a speed up compared to the best known classical algorithm and not the best one that could be possible, So it's all very, very, there's a lot of terms and conditions here. And I start thinking that, so my approach to quantum computing is not to worry so much about these speed ups. I think they stop us from thinking like creatively. So I'm thinking often about a machine that works slightly different. So we do computer science a little bit different and we can find solutions that are just a little bit different. And if one day they will be easily simulatable on a classical computer, then we found a new way to do machine learning, maybe that, wasn't there before, which I'm totally happy with. So maybe that's a bit of an anticlimax, but I'm not a believer in the magic of quantum computing so much.
Yeah, one of the questions that we got in was, should everyone now really learn about this? Because if we don't, then we're out of a job in 10 years. But I think you answered that
No.
question. But I
Yeah,
am curious
only if you
about,
want to.
yeah, but I'm really curious about your answer to a next question that came in. Said, if somebody's really interested in this field, what, how could, how could somebody enter? Now, you said just for yourself, I just started exploring, and it was all good fun, and I was on the learning curve, and I really enjoyed that. Most people, try to optimize their pathway a little bit. So, if you were talking to students now and say, "Hey, this sounds really great. I would like to do a PhD or maybe research in this, or go work for Xanadu," what would you recommend they study? So the question here was, should I study
Yes.
physics? Should I study mathematics? Where would I even start?
So I think a couple of years ago, you would have to have a physics degree because the conditions or the language we used was just so specific in some sense that it would be really hard to read a paper without even probably a PhD in physics. So there were papers that I read like for 3 or 4 years and I still don't entirely understand what they do. So, but this changed a lot, especially since now software has entered the field. So I showed you the example of Penny Lane. There are a lot of other, software frameworks out there. And I think the best entry point is really software because it's often written by companies who want to be quantum machine learning to be adopted by as many people as possible. And that includes non-scientists, non-specialists, non-researchers. So if you kind of try to code up your first quantum computation and train it with packages like TensorFlow Quantum or YA or Penny Lane, and you don't understand what's happening, then it's actually a fault of the people who try to get you into this in some sense. So I think a lot of the documentations of these software libraries are good places. And which degree you should study. I personally, I'm very biased. I think you can study physics and maths, so this will help you a lot. But I think studying data science and machine learning would actually help us a lot because we have still a lot of people coming from quantum computing and relatively few people from classical machine learning. And I think we would have very, very different viewpoints and ideas if we would kind of shed off a bit more of our baggage that we have from the last 40 years of doing things always in the same way. So I would really like to see that. And then lastly, if you allow me a comment also, so I know maybe when I said I was free to choose and then it just all happened, it sounds a bit like an easygoing story, but it actually what happened there was a slightly bit different, and I think it's a lesson I learned that's actually quite valuable, and that is, so what happened was I kind of didn't really know what to do with my life or wanted to do something, but it didn't work out in my life, right? My career, my planned career of I wanted to become a peace and conflict researcher. I wanted to work for the United Nations, all of those things. Completely didn't work out in the first steps. It was cut short. And it was really out of this crisis that I kind of tried something else. And now what I was saying earlier is this liberating feeling of not, if you have of not really needing to succeed in a field gives you actually sometimes the superpower of actually doing things very differently. And it gives you a lot of freedom as well. And it makes you stop worrying. So it doesn't mean I didn't worry all my career, what I would do one day. And if I ever get a job in there, in some sense, I didn't have a different choice. And then, so that was the situation back then. So optimize your life, but look a bit into what are actually the optimization parameters and don't follow the ones that are coming from the outside and that we think they are. So that's the
Yeah.
short and the long of it.
Yeah, I really like this comment, Mariah. I mean, in my own life, I've I stopped trying to optimize really early on when I realized that I didn't really even understand how to formulate the objective function. Nor did I
Exactly. And
really understand any of the boundary conditions or constraints on the problem. And also my career, I've really just jumped on opportunities. If something really interesting came up, I would just go for it and see how that worked out. And I think I've been
that's a very
lucky.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very nice picture you've got there about the objective function, because to reveal what it is actually not so easy, and it's probably 90% of the job done. And just to give an example, a lot of people come and ask, like, where should I do my PhD, because I can't get into the big universities like Stanford, like MIT. They just won't take me, right? So what should I do? So, and I sometimes think that they sometimes understand their objective function also wrong, because in lots of cases, if you really like a competitive work environment and that is what you need, then this might be your pathway. However, 90% of us, I would say, don't need a very competitive work environment to find themselves. So, for example, I needed freedom. Like, I just needed no one to tell me what to do. And that helped me, right? So sometimes we're just following this objective function that everyone thinks is global, but it's actually not so global. Like, you know, so if you need more like some bit of gentle push, or a boss who understands you, who might not be in your field, but who gives you support and lets you go to conferences, this can be such a big boost compared to being a big, very competitive group, right?
Yes, and I completely agree with you. I mean, I always say to people when they worry about not getting into these big name universities is that they're really not the best thing since sliced bread, as they seem to think. And there are many, many, many ways to reach a level of success and happiness or whatever else your objective function looks like. I certainly never thought I would end up there. I really lucked into being at Stanford for my PhD, and now also as professor. And I've been at other places, and I've seen so many people so very successful and content and happy, and really at home in their work and in the community, without going to these big name places. And talking about that, y- you did some crazy things because you're not from South Africa originally, so you've gone to places you probably didn't think you would go when you were 16 or 17 years old.
Yes, I always wanted to end up in Norway for some reason. I even learned Norwegian, but then just before I thought like I'd moved there, I had an internship in South Africa, and that was when I immigrated. I think I was like 24 or something. I just stayed basically. So sometimes you find your place. And getting back to the objective function, for example, this was my objective function, was I wanted to be here. So that was much higher than the objective function value of getting rich or being successful. So yeah, so this is why I'm still here, and I'm trying everything I can not to leave. So that's still the
I
case.
was going to ask you if you were very keen on staying in South Africa, because of course you're also connected to Toronto. So I was wondering, well, maybe you're moving to Canada at some point. But the answer to that is very clear. So thank you so much, Mariah, for being here with us again for this deeper dive. I'm always amazed how fast the time flies, and I appreciate particularly your openness about your career path and your choices. And there's some very valuable lessons there that you shared with us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of WIDS.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a big, big pleasure. Thanks a lot.